There is a moment every gardener knows. It arrives sometime in June, usually on a warm morning, when the light is soft and the garden is green and everything growing inside, it looks exactly the way it was supposed to look. The tomatoes are climbing. The cucumbers are vining. The zucchini is doing what zucchini always does, producing faster than any one household can reasonably eat. Standing at the edge of a garden like that, it is almost impossible to believe that anything could go wrong. That feeling is the problem. Not because the garden is lying. The plants are healthy. The harvest is real. But what that beautiful June garden is not showing, what it cannot show, is what happens next. 60 days from now, those same beds will look different. 90 days from now, some of them will be finished entirely. And the gardeners who spent June admiring what they had, instead of planting what they needed, will walk outside in late August and find something that looks less like a harvest and more like a farewell. Every year, millions of gardeners make the same mistake. They treat June like the finish line. The seeds are in the ground, the plants are growing, and the hardest work feels behind them. So they slow down. They maintain. They water and weed and wait. And by the time August arrives, hot, relentless, and unforgiving, the garden begins to collapse right on schedule, exactly the way it was always going to, because the decisions that could have prevented it were never made. This is not a story about bad luck. It is not a story about difficult weather or unusual pests or a growing season gone wrong. This is a story about timing, and about 5 crops that exist precisely to solve the problem most gardeners don't even know they have. Those 5 crops will not save a garden that has already been abandoned. But planted in June, in the right sequence, in the right way, they will do something far more valuable. They will keep a garden producing, genuinely, abundantly producing, all the way through fall. Some of them will push that harvest deep into winter. And one of them, planted this month, will still be feeding a household when February arrives and the seed catalogs for next spring are just beginning to appear in the mailbox. That is not an exaggeration. That is what intentional June planting looks like when it works. But here is the part that makes this harder than it sounds. The window for all 5 of these crops is not infinite. Some of them have biological clocks that cannot be negotiated with. Miss the window by 2 weeks, and the math no longer works. Hi viewers, before the first crop is revealed, here is a simple question worth answering in the comments below. Have you ever planted a second round of vegetables later in summer to extend your harvest? Yes or no? There is no wrong answer, and it helps to know where everyone is starting from. Now, the first crop. It carries a name most gardeners recognize immediately. It sits on the shelf at every farm stand in October, stacked in bins alongside pumpkins and gourds, priced like a seasonal reward for the patience of autumn. And because that is where most people encounter it. In fall, already harvested, already finished, most gardeners assume that is also when it gets planted. That assumption costs them the entire harvest. Winter squash, not a fall planting, not a late summer planting. A June planting, started now, grown through the full heat of summer, and harvested in early fall when the shells have hardened and the vines have dried and the fruit is ready to be carried inside and stored for months without refrigeration, without canning, without any processing at all. Here is the number that explains everything. 120 days. That is how long some winter squash varieties need from seed to harvest-ready fruit. Count backward from the first frost date. Then count again. Because what that calculation reveals is that a gardener who waits until August to plant winter squash is not getting a harvest worth having. The days to maturity run straight past the frost date, and the season ends before the fruit ever finishes. June is the window, and it is already open. Varieties like butternut, kabocha, Hubbard, and acorn need that full summer runway to develop the thick, hardened shells that make long-term storage possible. A squash grown through a complete season, harvested in early fall, can last 3 to 6 months in a cool, dry space. That is food security that does not require a freezer. That is a pantry that keeps feeding a household through the coldest months of the year on the strength of a single June planting decision. But there is a complication, and it is the reason many gardeners who do plant winter squash in June still walk away with nothing to show for it in October. Pest pressure. Summer is not a gentle season. By July and August, the insects that destroy squash crops are operating at full strength. Vine borers tunnel through stems. Beetles move from plant to plant carrying disease. A gardener who plants a beautiful, completely vulnerable winter squash variety into that environment is taking a risk the data does not support. The solution is not chemicals. The solution is selection. There are varieties developed, some by generations of indigenous growers, some by careful modern breeders, specifically to survive a full summer season. The Seminole pumpkin, cultivated across the American Southeast for centuries, produces in conditions that would end the season for most commercial varieties. The Zucchino rampicant, a climbing Italian heirloom, carries resistance that most modern hybrids have lost entirely. Butternut squash demonstrates a natural resilience in most climates that makes it one of the most dependable choices for a June planting. Choose the right variety. Plant it now. Give it the full summer window it needs. And then carry those squash inside in October and set them somewhere cool and dark and dry. They will still be there in January. Still firm. Still good. Still feeding whoever planted them back in June when everyone else had already stopped. That is not luck. That is planning. And the next crop on this list requires even more of it. Because it has a biological clock that June can still satisfy, but July absolutely cannot. Sweet potatoes do not forgive late decisions. They are patient in almost every other way. Slow growing, quietly productive, asking very little from the gardener who tends them through the long months of summer. But on the question of timing, they are completely uncompromising. They need warmth. They need humidity. They need a long, unbroken runway of summer heat to do what they were designed to do underground. Invisible, unhurried, for 4 to 5 months. Miss the June window, and that runway disappears. What gets planted in July might vine beautifully. It might climb and sprawl and cover every available surface with lush, dark green leaves that look like the most productive thing in the entire garden. But beneath the soil, where the actual harvest lives, the roots will be small, underdeveloped, not worth the season they consumed. The vine is not the crop. The root is the crop. And the root needs time that only June can still provide. Here is what most gardeners do not know about sweet potatoes. They are not potatoes. Not even close. A conventional potato is a tuber, a swollen underground stem that belongs to the nightshade family and thrives in cool, slightly damp soil. A sweet potato is something entirely different. It is the storage root of a tropical vine, a relative of the morning glory, and it wants conditions that would stress or end a conventional potato entirely. Hot soil, high humidity, warm nights, long days. The kind of summer that pushes most cool season crops completely out of production is exactly the environment where sweet potatoes thrive. Understanding that changes everything about how they get grown. It also explains the fertilizer mistake, the one that costs gardeners their harvest without ever showing them clearly what went wrong. When a plant looks like it needs more, the instinct is to feed it. More compost, more nitrogen, more of whatever made the garden lush and green in spring. Applied to sweet potatoes, that instinct produces exactly the wrong result. Nitrogen tells the vine to grow, and the vine, given enough of it, will grow magnificently, spreading across beds, climbing fences, producing an abundance of beautiful green foliage that looks like productivity, but is not. The root stops developing when the vine takes over. Every bit of energy the plant produces gets redirected upward, into leaves, into runners, into growth that photographs well and harvests as almost nothing. Sandy soil, low organic matter, minimal nitrogen. Those are the conditions that send the plant's energy downward, into the root, into the harvest that actually matters. This is why so many gardeners try sweet potatoes once and walk away convinced they simply don't work. The plant worked perfectly. The approach was wrong. Sweet potatoes are not grown from seed. They are grown from slips, short vine cuttings taken from a sprouted root, rooted in water for 3 to 5 days until small roots emerge from the nodes, then transplanted into warm soil. A single sweet potato, given the right conditions, will produce enough slips to plant a meaningful harvest. And those slips, once settled into their growing space, will spend the next 4 months doing quiet underground work that only reveals itself at harvest time. 25-gallon grow bags change the harvesting experience entirely. No digging, no guessing, no cutting through roots with a shovel in the dark. The bag gets tipped, the soil falls away, and the harvest is simply there. 8, 10, sometimes 12 pounds of sweet potatoes from a single container, pulled in one clean motion. 5 to 7 slips per bag. Sandy, well-draining mix. Bone meal and a light phosphorus source worked in at planting. Then patience, and almost nothing else. The sweet potato does not need supervision. It needs time. And the only way to give it enough time is to plant it now, before the warm season starts subtracting days instead of adding them. What comes out of those bags in October will last through winter. It will store in a cool, dry space for months without any processing. It will feed a household long after the last cucumber has been picked and the last summer vine has gone quiet. And speaking of cucumbers, the next crop on this list is the one that stings the most. Because the plants currently thriving in most gardens right now, the ones that look the healthiest, the most productive, the most promising of anything growing this season, are already on their way out. Their way out. They just haven't shown it yet. Look at them. Healthy vines, deep green leaves, cucumbers forming faster than a kitchen can use them. Zucchini so productive it starts appearing on neighbors' porches without explanation. This is what June success looks like in the vegetable garden, and it is genuinely something worth appreciating. It is also a countdown clock. Every cucumber vine, every zucchini plant currently thriving in a June garden has a lifespan, not a season-long lifespan. Not a frost-to-frost lifespan. A sprint, 60 to 90 days of genuine production, followed by a rapid decline that no amount of fertilizer or careful tending will reverse. These are not long-distance crops. They were never designed to be. They are fast-germinating, fast-producing, fast-finishing plants that exhaust themselves in the act of producing and leave nothing behind. By August, pest pressure builds in numbers that overwhelm even healthy plants. Disease spreads through aging foliage. The vines that looked unstoppable in June collapse right on schedule, exactly the way they were always going to, in the final weeks of summer. Here is what that means in practical terms. A gardener who planted cucumbers in April and never planted again will have no cucumbers by September. The vines will be finished. The season will still have 8 weeks left on the calendar, and the gap between what the garden could have produced and what it actually produced will be measured in empty beds. Succession planting closes that gap. Plant new seeds every 4 to 6 weeks so that young, healthy plants are always entering peak production as older ones decline. While the April cucumbers are finishing in August, the June cucumbers are just beginning. The harvest never stops. It simply transfers from one generation of plants to the next. This is not complicated. It is a decision, made in June, when the current plants look so good that the next planting feels unnecessary. That pays out for the rest of the season. In gardens where pest pressure is high, starting new cucumber and zucchini seeds indoors provides a real advantage. Clean plants. Untouched. No early damage. No stress wounds that invite disease. No setbacks that shorten an already limited productive window. Transplanted at 4 to 5 weeks, they enter the garden healthy and ready. In lower pressure environments, direct sowing into warm soil works just as well. Either way, the decision needs to happen now, not in July, when the current plants begin to struggle and the impulse to act finally arrives. By July, the seeds that should have been starting in June are already behind. The window that succession planting was designed to capture closes a little more every day. Start the seeds. Let the current plants have their moment. Because what comes next, the October tomato that most gardeners never believed was possible, depends on a decision that also has to be made in June. And it is the most surprising one on this entire list. Say the words fall tomatoes to most gardeners and watch what happens. Skepticism. A slow shake of the head. The patient explanation that tomatoes are a spring crop, that the season is already committed, that the plants currently in the ground are the ones that will carry the harvest through to the end. The idea of starting new tomato seeds in June, indoors, for a late summer transplant, sounds like unnecessary work at best and wishful thinking at worst. It is neither. It is the decision that produces fresh tomatoes in October. Here is the reality most gardeners never get told about their spring tomato plants. Indeterminate varieties are capable of producing all season in ideal conditions. But ideal conditions do not last all season in most climates. Heat builds. Humidity accumulates. Fungal pressure arrives with the hottest weeks of summer and works steadily through aging foliage that has already spent months fighting everything the season threw at it. By August, most indeterminate tomatoes are not thriving. They are enduring. And there is a meaningful difference between a plant that is thriving and one that is simply still standing. Determinate varieties finish faster. They set their fruit, ripen their load, and complete their cycle within a compressed window. In climates with long, hot summers, that window closes well before the frost date, leaving weeks, sometimes months, of growing season with no tomatoes being produced at all. A second planting fixes this. Seeds started indoors in early June will be ready for transplanting by late July or early August, exactly when the spring planting is declining and the garden most needs something new entering production. Fast-maturing determinates, 65 days or fewer from transplant to ripe fruit, are the only realistic choice for a fall crop. Disease resistance matters more in a fall planting than a spring one, because these plants will face peak pressure during their most vulnerable early weeks. And then there is the green tomato strategy, the one that turns an approaching frost from a loss into an opportunity. When the first frost advisory of the season appears, that moment most gardeners dread, the grower who planted a fall crop does something different. They go outside and pick every mature green tomato on the vine. Every one. They carry them inside and set them somewhere cool and dark and dry. A garage, a basement, a quiet corner of a pantry. Green tomatoes ripen slowly in cool indoor conditions. Not all at once. Steadily, one or two at a time, over the course of weeks. A harvest gathered in early November will still be producing ripe fruit in January. The season does not end with the frost. It simply moves inside. That is not a trick. That is a food system. Now, the fifth crop, the one that almost no gardener thinks to plant in summer. The one that gets overlooked every single year because it does not fit the mental image of a warm season garden. The one that produces a harvest in fall, stores through winter, and carries a household's food supply all the way to the following spring. Onions. Most gardeners grow them once, in spring, as part of the standard seasonal planting. They harvest in early summer, cure them, use them until they run out, and wait until next year. The idea of growing onions again, in the same year, for a second harvest that arrives in fall and stores until spring, simply never occurs to most home growers. But it works, completely, reliably, and with a return that almost nothing else in the vegetable garden can match. The key is understanding how onions decide to bulb. They do not respond to temperature or rainfall the way most crops do. They respond to day length. Long day varieties, planted in spring, bulb when daylight hours are at their longest, which is why they produce well at the conventional time of year. Short day varieties bulb when day length is shorter in early spring or in fall, which makes them the only realistic choice for an off-season planting. Seeds started indoors in June, given 8 to 10 weeks to develop into transplant-ready seedlings, will be ready for the garden in August. From there, they grow through the cooling weeks of late summer and early fall, reaching harvest size somewhere between October and late November, depending on variety and conditions. Pull them in fall. Cure them properly. Store them somewhere cool and dry. They will last until spring. Available every time a recipe calls for one, for 6 months after the harvest that most gardeners stop thinking about in August. This is what the full picture looks like. Winter squash curing in a cool corner of the house, hard-shelled and patient, waiting to be roasted in December. Sweet potatoes filling the pantry with dense, storable food that cost almost nothing to grow. A second wave of cucumbers still producing in September, young enough to outrun the pests that finished the spring planting weeks ago. Fresh tomatoes ripening in October, and green ones sitting in a garage, quietly finishing what the vine started all the way through January. And onions, dozens of them, providing one of the most essential ingredients in any kitchen through every meal of winter and into the first days of the following spring. That is not an extraordinary garden. That is a planned one. The difference between a gardener who eats well in June and one who eats well in February is not skill. It is not money. It is not access to rare seeds or a perfect climate. It is the decisions made in June, quiet, forward-looking decisions made while everything already planted looks so good that doing more feels almost unnecessary. Small protections extend everything. Shade cloth reduces heat stress during the peak of summer. Insect netting keeps pest populations from overwhelming young succession plantings before they establish. A simple cover over vulnerable crops keeps fungal disease from spreading through wet foliage during summer storms. These are not complex systems. They are small decisions that compound across an entire season. The growers who make them harvest more consistently, not because they work harder, because they think further ahead. That is what this channel is built on. Not the single season, not the one harvest, not the annual reset that starts over from scratch every spring as if nothing carried forward. The harvest legacy is about building something that grows in value every year, a food system that gets more reliable every season because the decisions behind it get more intentional. 5 crops in June is where that starts. For a lot of growers, it is where everything changes. But June crops are only part of the picture. There is another category of growing that does not appear on any monthly planning calendar. One that most gardeners never discover until they have already spent years replanting the same annuals season after season. One that changes the equation permanently, not for a season, but for a generation. Plant it once. Harvest it for 20 years. Sometimes 30. Sometimes longer than a single grower will ever witness alone. That is what is coming next on this channel. One specific plant in that category, largely overlooked, almost never discussed, produces more food per square foot than nearly anything else that can be grown in a temperate climate. It requires almost no maintenance after establishment, and most gardeners walking past it at the nursery have never once considered putting it in the ground. That is the next video. And if planting something once and harvesting it for the rest of a lifetime sounds like exactly the kind of growing this channel was built for, it is. Do not miss it. Please, like, share, and subscribe.